Close your eyes. Slow your breathing. Imagine the continent of Europe in the year 1940, wrapped in the stillness that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. The storm of war had already broken across the continent. Poland had been crushed. France had fallen in only 6 weeks. The armies of Hitler's Third Reich stood victorious from the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Soviet frontier. Britain resisted still, its cities pounded by nightly bombing raids. But across the mainland, German banners and swastikas dominated the horizon. And yet, despite the speed of conquest and the devastation already unleashed, another storm, even greater, even darker, was gathering. One that would dwarf everything that had come before, one that would hurl millions of soldiers into battle, turn entire cities into graveyards, and alter the course of the world. This chapter tells the story of the months before that storm, the uneasy quiet, the tense diplomacy, the illusions of safety, and the preparations that were made in secret. It is a chapter of whispers, of suspicions, of men convinced of their destiny, and of ordinary people unaware that their lives were about to be consumed. It is the calm before Operation Barbarossa, the pact that shocked the world. To understand the stillness of 1940 and 1941, we must go back 2 years earlier, to August 1939. On a summer's evening in Moscow, German and Soviet officials gathered to sign an agreement that stunned the world. It was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of Germany and the Soviet Union, Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov. The pact was a non-aggression treaty. Publicly, it promised peace between Hitler and Stalin. Secretly, it contained a protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and parts of Romania were carved up in advance, their fates decided without their consent. To outsiders, the pact seemed impossible. Fascist Germany and Communist Russia were supposed to be mortal enemies. Hitler had raged against Bolshevism in his book Mein Kampf. Stalin, in turn, had long denounced fascism as a deadly threat, and yet, out of cold calculation, they had shaken hands. Hitler wanted to invade Poland without risking a two-front war. Stalin wanted time to build Soviet industry, time to rearm, time to recover from his brutal purges of the Red Army. And so enemies became partners, if only for a moment. Poland divided, Europe plunged into war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 2 weeks later, the Red Army marched in from the east. In less than a month, the country was overrun. German and Soviet soldiers even held a joint victory parade in the Polish city of Brest-Litovsk. The world was aghast. Britain and France declared war on Germany, beginning World War II in Europe. Yet Stalin stood aside, shielded by his deal with Hitler. He annexed eastern Poland, then moved to absorb the Baltic states. In the winter of 1939-40, he attacked Finland in the Winter War, suffering heavy losses, but eventually forcing concessions. By the spring of 1940, the Soviet Union had expanded its borders, while Germany turned westward to strike France. The pact held, but only on the surface. Hitler's Eastern Dream. Adolf Hitler never intended the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to be permanent. In his heart, his gaze was fixed eastward. Since the 1920s, he had spoken of Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. Germany, he believed, needed vast territories in the east to feed its population and sustain its power. Those territories lay in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The Slavic peoples who lived there in Hitler's worldview were inferior. They were to be enslaved or exterminated. Their land would be colonized by German farmers. Their cities would be starved, their resources plundered. And above all, the communist state, what Hitler called the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, would be destroyed. So when he shook Stalin's hand in 1939, Hitler saw it as a temporary convenience. Once the West was secured, once Britain was neutralized or isolated, the East would be next. Stalin's illusions of safety. Joseph Stalin, meanwhile, was deeply suspicious of Germany, yet he clung to the belief that the pact gave him breathing space. The Soviet Union, though massive, was not ready for war. Stalin's purges of 1937–38 had devastated the Red Army. Thousands of experienced officers had been executed, imprisoned, or humiliated. The command structure was broken, morale low, and initiative crushed. The Soviet Union had industrialized rapidly under Stalin's 5-year plans, but the military machine was still unbalanced. New tanks and aircraft were being produced, but many units were equipped with obsolete weapons. Communication systems were primitive. Training was uneven. Stalin knew all this. He calculated that war with Germany was inevitable, but not yet. If he could delay it until 1942 or 1943, he believed the Red Army would be ready. Thus, he embraced the pact with Hitler, even as he mistrusted it. The illusions of 1940. After France fell in June 1940, the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically. Germany dominated the continent. Italy joined the war as Hitler's ally. Only Britain remained defiant. For a moment, Stalin believed this worked in his favor. Surely Hitler would not risk turning east while Britain still resisted. Surely Germany would not open a second front. Soviet diplomats continued to trade with Germany. Trains carried oil, grain, and raw materials westward. German trains brought machinery and weapons eastward. On the surface, it looked like partnership. Behind the curtain, both sides prepared for betrayal. Hitler's decision. In the summer of 1940, as German armies celebrated victory in France, Hitler made up his mind. Britain, though weakened, refused to surrender. The Luftwaffe began the Battle of Britain but failed to force the island nation to its knees. Hitler concluded that Britain was only holding on in hope of Soviet or American help. If the Soviet Union was crushed, Hitler believed, Britain would lose all hope and sue for peace. In December 1940, he issued Directive 21, the secret order for the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was codenamed Operation Barbarossa, after Frederick Barbarossa, a medieval emperor who had once led a crusade eastward. The German preparations. Once the order was given, preparations began on an immense scale. Along the eastern frontier in occupied Poland, East Prussia, and Romania, the German army began to mass. Railways were repaired and extended, supplies were stockpiled, soldiers drilled. By the spring of 1941, over 3 million German troops had been assembled, supported by hundreds of thousands of Romanian, Hungarian, and Finnish soldiers. It was the largest invasion force in history. Yet all of this was hidden from the outside world. German propaganda continued to speak of friendship with the Soviet Union. Diplomats exchanged toasts. Stalin, though wary, chose to believe them. Warnings ignored. Not everyone was fooled. Soviet intelligence received dozens of warnings. British codebreakers passed on reports. Even Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy in Tokyo, confirmed the invasion date. Soviet generals urged Stalin to mobilize. But Stalin dismissed them all. He believed the warnings were British tricks, designed to provoke war between Germany and the Soviet Union. He silenced his generals. He refused to let the Red Army take defensive measures, fearing it would provoke Hitler. And so, in June 1941, Soviet forces were caught unprepared. Life along the frontier. Imagine now the frontier towns of Eastern Europe in those last days before Barbarossa. In Poland and the Baltic states occupied by Germans, villages saw endless columns of soldiers moving east, roads filled with trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons. At night, the sound of engines echoed in the forests. On the Soviet side, soldiers stood guard but without urgency. Airfields were crowded with planes parked wingtip to wingtip, many without camouflage. Units were scattered, many in exposed positions. Civilians lived their lives as normal, harvesting crops, going to markets, celebrating weddings, unaware that their world was about to collapse. The calm before catastrophe. This was the calm before the storm. A false peace, stretched thin by distrust. Hitler believed he was on the verge of a quick, decisive victory. Stalin believed he had more time. Both were wrong, but in different ways. The silence of 1940 and early 1941 was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The armies were ready, the plans were written, the storm was gathering. And yet for millions of people, life continued in ordinary rhythms. A farmer plowed his field, a child played by a river, a soldier wrote a letter home. None of them could imagine that within weeks their villages would be burned, their cities besieged, and their families scattered or killed. History often moves quietly before it moves violently. The months before Barbarossa remind us of that truth. They were months of illusion, of calculation, of denial, and of destiny. When the storm finally broke on June 22, 1941, it would become the greatest land invasion the world had ever seen. But before that, there was this, the uneasy calm, a continent holding its breath. Two dictators preparing to gamble everything, millions of innocent lives suspended on the edge of disaster. Picture the dimly lit halls of the German High Command in late 1940. Maps stretch across long tables marked with colored arrows, generals bend over charts, secretaries scribble notes. The air is thick with cigar smoke and tension. Beyond the closed doors of these war councils, Europe appears quiet. But inside, plans are being drawn for the largest invasion in the history of mankind. This is the story of how Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, was planned. It is a story of confidence and arrogance, of calculations and miscalculations, of numbers and logistics and ideology. It is the story of how Germany, at the height of its power, prepared to gamble everything on a single blow. Hitler's Directive 21. On December 18, 1940, Adolf Hitler issued a secret document known as Directive Number 21. It read, "The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign before the end of the war against England." This directive set the wheels in motion. It made clear that Hitler no longer saw Britain as the immediate problem. He believed Britain held out only in hope that the Soviet Union or the United States would eventually come to its aid. If the Soviet Union was destroyed, Britain would lose all hope, and the war in Europe would be won. The directive laid down the broad strokes: an attack on a wide front aimed at destroying Soviet forces in western Russia and reaching a line from Archangel in the north to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea in the south. It was breathtaking in ambition, as if the German army could sweep across thousands of kilometers in a single campaign. Army groups, the three-pronged assault. The plan divided the invasion force into three great army groups. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, would advance through the Baltic states, seize Leningrad, and link up with Finnish forces. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would deliver the main thrust. It would advance through Belarus, capture Smolensk, and then march on Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would strike into Ukraine, seize Kiev, and capture the rich farmlands, coal mines, and oil fields. Each group was vast in its own right. Together, they formed the largest invasion force ever assembled. The numbers behind the invasion. Operation Barbarossa gathered a staggering array of men and machines. 3.2 million German soldiers supported by more than 600,000 troops from Axis allies including Romania, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and Finland. 3,500 tanks divided among 19 panzer divisions. 7,000 artillery pieces ready to unleash devastation. 2,800 aircraft, giving the Luftwaffe overwhelming superiority. 600,000 motor vehicles and nearly 750,000 horses, reminding us that this modern war still relied heavily on animal power. Facing them was the Red Army, enormous in size but poorly led and poorly prepared. On paper, the Soviets had more tanks and planes than the Germans, but many were obsolete. Many soldiers were untrained, and Stalin's purges had left the officer corps gutted. The assumptions of German planners. German generals assumed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. They believed the Red Army could be destroyed in a few great battles near the border. They believed Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev would fall in weeks. They believed the Soviet state, hated by its own people, would crumble once the first blows landed. Hitler himself thought the war would last no more than 3 to 6 months. He told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This confidence was born from recent experience. In Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, and Greece, the Wehrmacht had triumphed with dazzling speed. Why should Russia be different? But behind this confidence lay a fatal miscalculation. The Soviet Union was vast beyond imagination. Its people were hardened by hardship. Its armies, though poorly led, were immense. And its factories, hidden deep in the interior, could be moved eastward out of German reach. Ideology as strategy. Barbarossa was more than a military operation. It was an ideological crusade. Hitler did not see it as a conventional war, but as a war of annihilation. German planners developed the so-called Hunger Plan. The idea was simple and brutal. German soldiers would seize Soviet grain and food for themselves. The cities, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, would be left to starve. Millions of people would die, and their deaths were not a byproduct but a goal. This thinking shaped the invasion. German soldiers were told they were fighting not just an army but an entire system, a race, an ideology. They were told not to expect quarter and not to give any. From the very beginning, Barbarossa was meant to be genocidal. Logistics and supply challenges. On the maps in Berlin, the arrows looked simple. In reality, moving millions of men and machines across such distances was a nightmare. The Soviet Union used a different railway gauge than Germany. This meant that every mile of track captured had to be torn up and rebuilt before German trains could use it. Supplies had to be moved by truck or horse-drawn wagon along primitive roads. Fuel shortages loomed constantly. The Wehrmacht was fast, but it was not built for a long-distance campaign of thousands of kilometers. Its strength lay in short, sharp blitzkrieg strikes. If the Red Army collapsed quickly, the plan would work. But if the Soviets held on, the German army would outrun its supply lines and stall. The Soviet side of the border. While Germany prepared, the Soviet Union seemed blind. Intelligence reports poured in, warnings from Britain, from spies in Berlin and Tokyo, from Soviet border agents who saw German troops massing. Yet Stalin refused to believe them. He thought Hitler would not risk war until Britain was defeated. He feared that any Soviet mobilization would provoke Germany, and so he ordered his troops to stay quiet. Planes remained lined up on airfields. Ammunition was not distributed. Units were not moved to defensive positions. In the end, this hesitation would be catastrophic. The Allies and the wider world, outside of Germany and the Soviet Union, the world watched uneasily. Britain, battered but unbroken, hoped desperately that Hitler would turn east. If Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill reasoned, Britain might gain a powerful ally. The United States, still neutral, observed from afar. President Roosevelt offered aid to Britain, but American involvement remained limited. The prospect of a German-Soviet war was seen by many in Washington as a clash of dictators that might weaken both. For the peoples of Eastern Europe, there was little comfort. Poland was already divided. The Baltic states had been absorbed into the Soviet Union. Romania had been forced to cede territory to both Germany and the USSR. These lands would soon become battlegrounds once more. Soldiers waiting. Imagine now the German soldiers massed along the frontier in the spring of 1941. For months they drilled, marched, and prepared. Villages in occupied Poland and East Prussia overflowed with troops. Local civilians saw endless columns of vehicles, the forests echoing with the sound of engines and boots. Many soldiers were confident. They had known only victory. They expected another swift campaign, one that would end before Christmas. Some wrote letters home promising they would return soon. Others dreamed of glory and medals. Few understood the scale of what was about to unfold. On the Soviet side, soldiers stood on guard duty with little sense of urgency. They saw the German build-up but were told to remain calm. Orders from Moscow insisted that Germany was not preparing to attack. Some Red Army soldiers even traded with Germans across the border in a strange, brief camaraderie before the storm. The final weeks. As May turned to June 1941, the invasion force was ready. Divisions were in place, supplies were stockpiled. The Luftwaffe prepared to strike hundreds of Soviet airfields simultaneously. Still, the mask of friendship remained. On June 14th, just 8 days before the invasion, the Soviet Union held a grand parade in Moscow to celebrate its independence. German diplomats attended, toasts were exchanged, smiles were forced, and all the while Hitler's generals waited for the signal. The launch date was set for June 22nd, 1941. The illusion of control. Both dictators believed they were in control. Hitler believed he was about to achieve the greatest victory in German history. Stalin believed he had time, that his pact with Germany would hold at least another year. Both were wrong. The calm before Barbarossa was not peace. It was the silence before an explosion. It was the pause before the single most destructive military campaign ever attempted. Operation Barbarossa was planned with confidence but built on arrogance. It was drawn on maps with precision but without respect for geography, climate, or the resilience of human beings. It was born of ideology as much as strategy. When the invasion began, it would unleash suffering on a scale beyond imagination. But in the months before June 1941, it existed only as a plan, vast, ambitious, and fatally flawed. And so, as this chapter closes, we leave the war rooms of Berlin, the silent barracks along the frontier, the uneasy stillness of Moscow, and the millions of lives suspended in waiting. The stage is set, the armies are ready, the orders are written, the calm is about to shatter. It was a quiet summer night along the frontier between Germany and the Soviet Union. The date was June 22nd, 1941. In the early hours, the world still slept. Villages were silent. Rivers ran gently through forests. Soldiers on both sides of the border stood their watch, some weary, some restless, many thinking of home. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine and soil. And then, without warning, without declaration, without mercy, the stillness shattered. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the largest invasion force in the history of warfare surged forward. Artillery roared, searchlights cut across the sky, German bombers thundered overhead, tanks rolled eastward, engines growling like iron beasts. Millions of men moved almost as one, crossing a frontier that only the day before had been cloaked in uneasy calm. This was Operation Barbarossa, the scale of the assault. The invasion stretched across a line more than 2,900 kilometers long, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Over 3 million German soldiers surged forward, supported by 500,000 Axis allies from Romania, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and Finland. The attack began with an immense artillery barrage. German guns opened fire in unison, pounding Soviet positions. Within minutes, the Luftwaffe joined the assault. Thousands of aircraft swept into Soviet skies. Their targets were clear: Soviet airfields, command posts, rail junctions. Caught by surprise, the Soviet Air Force suffered catastrophic losses. In the first hours alone, more than 1,200 Soviet planes were destroyed, many still on the ground. Pilots barely had time to scramble into their cockpits before their machines were consumed in flames. The Red Armies, stunned and disorganized, struggled to respond. Communications broke down, orders were delayed, whole divisions were caught unprepared, their barracks and camps smashed before they could even mobilize. Stalin's shock. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin was awakened by frantic reports. At first, he refused to believe them. For months, he had dismissed warnings of German invasion as provocations. Even as German shells fell on Soviet territory, Stalin convinced himself it must be some misunderstanding, perhaps rogue generals acting without Hitler's approval. Only as the scale of the assault became undeniable did reality sink in. Hitler had betrayed him. The pact of non-aggression was nothing more than a mask, now cast aside. The Soviet Union was at war. Army Group North, the push through the Baltics. In the north, Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb's Army Group North surged forward. Panzer divisions sliced through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Their objective was Leningrad, the great city on the Neva River, cradle of the Russian Revolution. The Baltic states, annexed by the Soviet Union only the year before, were caught in the storm. Many locals, resentful of Soviet rule, initially welcomed the Germans as liberators, but the brutality of occupation would soon shatter those illusions. The advance was swift. German tanks covered dozens of kilometers a day, bypassing Soviet strongholds, encircling entire divisions. Soviet defenses collapsed in chaos. Within weeks, Army Group North was closing in on the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group Center, the drive toward Moscow. At the heart of Barbarossa was Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. With two powerful panzer groups commanded by Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, it smashed through Belarus with astonishing speed. The city of Minsk, capital of Belarus, fell within a week. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled in vast pockets. Entire armies vanished, swallowed up in cauldrons of steel. German soldiers marveled at their success. Column after column of prisoners marched westward. By the end of July, more than 600,000 Soviet troops had been captured in the Minsk and Smolensk battles. German generals believed victory was near. Army Group South, the struggle for Ukraine. Further south, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South faced a tougher fight. The terrain of Ukraine was vast and open, but Soviet resistance here was stiffer. The Red Army fought desperately to defend the fertile lands and industrial cities. Still, German tactics proved devastating. Tanks and motorized infantry bypassed strongpoints encircling Soviet formations. The city of Lvov fell quickly. German and Romanian forces pressed deeper into Ukraine, aiming for Kiev, the great capital on the Dnieper River. The battles in the south were brutal. Villages were burned. Civilians fled in panic. Yet, for all the destruction, the German advance continued. The first week. By the end of the first week, Barbarossa seemed unstoppable. German armies had advanced up to 500 kilometers into Soviet territory. The Red Army appeared shattered. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. German propaganda trumpeted victory. In Berlin, Hitler was jubilant. He told his generals that the campaign was already won. He boasted that the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. And yet beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The vastness of the land, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the logistical strains of such a colossal campaign would soon begin to show. Soviet resistance. Despite the shock, the Soviet Union did not collapse. In the chaos, soldiers fought back fiercely, sometimes to the last man. Civilians resisted in their own ways, burning crops before the Germans could seize them, sabotaging roads and bridges, joining partisan bands in the forests. Factories were dismantled and shipped eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Entire industries vanished overnight, only to reappear hundreds of kilometers away in the Ural Mountains or Siberia. It was a monumental feat of organization, born of desperation but fueled by determination. Stalin, after days of shock and silence, finally addressed the nation. On July 3rd, he spoke to the Soviet people by radio, calling on them to wage a great patriotic war against the invader. His words, broadcast across the vast land, galvanized resistance. The human cost. For civilians caught in the path of Barbarossa, life became a nightmare. Villages burned, families fled, carrying what little they could. Refugees clogged the roads, often overtaken by German tanks. The German invasion was accompanied by unprecedented brutality. Special units known as the Einsatzgruppen followed the army, tasked with executing Jews, communists, and other undesirables. In town after town, mass shootings began. The Holocaust had already begun in Poland, but with Barbarossa it expanded on an industrial scale. For Soviet prisoners of war, conditions were horrific. Captured by the hundreds of thousands, they were marched westward without food, water, or shelter. Many died on the roadside. By the end of 1941, over 2 million Soviet POWs would perish in German captivity. German confidence. Despite the brutality, German morale remained high in the summer of 1941. Soldiers believed they were winning a war of destiny. They wrote home describing endless victories, captured towns, and long columns of prisoners. They believed, as Hitler did, that the war would be over soon. Yet not all were so confident. Some officers, seeing the endless horizon of Russia, worried that the campaign was too vast. Supplies were already stretched thin, vehicles broke down, horses died from exhaustion. Still, the momentum carried them forward. The world reacts. News of the invasion spread quickly. In Britain, Winston Churchill, despite his hatred of communism, immediately pledged support for the Soviet Union. He declared that any enemy of Nazi Germany was Britain's ally. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt moved to extend aid to the Soviets through the Lend-Lease program. American weapons, trucks, and food would eventually flow into the Soviet Union, though in June 1941 such aid was still distant. For the world, Barbarossa marked a new phase of the war. The conflict was now truly global. The two most powerful dictatorships on Earth were locked in a struggle that would decide the fate of Europe. The opening of Operation Barbarossa was a shock to the world, a thunderclap that shattered the illusion of calm. It was the largest invasion in history, launched with confidence and cruelty. In its first days, it seemed unstoppable. Cities fell, armies were destroyed, millions were caught in the whirlwind. And yet, even in those early weeks, the seeds of German failure were already being sown. The land was too vast, the enemy too resilient, the brutality too savage to inspire surrender. As dawn broke on June 22, 1941, the storm of Barbarossa had begun. It would rage for 4 long years, leaving tens of millions dead and reshaping the world forever. A city of dreams and revolution. On the banks of the Neva River stood a city unlike any other in Russia. Founded by Tsar Peter the Great in 1703, St. Petersburg, later renamed Petrograd and then Leningrad, was designed to be Russia's window to the West. Its grand palaces, elegant boulevards, and sweeping canals gave it the air of a European capital. But Leningrad was more than architecture. It was a city of memory, of revolution, of culture. It was here that the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution first erupted, toppling centuries of monarchy. It was a symbol of Soviet pride, the birthplace of Lenin's movement, and thus sacred in the mythology of the communist state. For Hitler, Leningrad was more than a target of war. It was an idea to be erased, a city to be starved into dust. Its destruction was meant to be both strategic and symbolic, the death of the revolution in the very city where it was born. Army Group North moves. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, had a clear task. Advancing from East Prussia and the occupied Baltic states, its goal was to seize Leningrad. The German forces included 16 infantry divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and 3 motorized divisions, supported by Finnish troops under Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. The advance began swiftly. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, had only recently been annexed by the Soviet Union and their defenses were weak. Within weeks, German tanks rolled through Riga, then Tallinn. The Red Army retreated in confusion, leaving wreckage in its wake. As the Wehrmacht pressed northward, the Soviet government realized the danger. Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution, was in peril. The Baltic states caught in between. For the Baltic peoples, the German advance was complicated. Many had suffered under Soviet occupation in 1940-41, deportations, executions, forced collectivization. To some, the Germans seemed like liberators, but liberation soon gave way to oppression. German occupation brought its own horrors: the persecution of Jews, the exploitation of resources, the crushing of independence. Thus, even as German columns pushed toward Leningrad, the Baltic lands became a space of shifting loyalties, partisan struggles, and immense suffering. Stalin's orders. Not one step back. In Moscow, Stalin watched the German advance with alarm. Leningrad could not be lost. It was a city of immense industrial and symbolic importance. Factories in Leningrad produced tanks, artillery, and ships for the Red Army. Its shipyards on the Gulf of Finland built vital warships. Stalin issued urgent orders. The city must be defended at all costs. Soldiers, workers, and civilians alike were mobilized. Trenches were dug. Barricades rose across boulevards. Entire populations labored day and night to build defenses. The Leningrad Front, a Soviet military command, was created to coordinate the defense. Under Marshal Kliment Voroshilov and later General Georgy Zhukov, the city braced itself for siege. The German encirclement. By late August 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group North, joined by Finnish troops from the north, completed the encirclement. But Hitler made a critical choice. Rather than storm the city, he ordered it to be starved. He wrote, "Leningrad must be erased from the face of the earth. We have no interest in preserving even a part of its population." The German plan was to blockade Leningrad, cutting off all food, fuel, and supplies. Artillery would shell the city, the Luftwaffe would bomb it, hunger would do the rest. Thus began one of the longest and most terrible sieges in human history, the Siege of Leningrad, which would last 872 days, from September 1941 to January 1944. Life under siege. Inside the city, nearly 3 million people found themselves trapped. The encirclement was swift, evacuation was limited. Families who had stayed now faced the unimaginable. At first, people hoped the siege would be short. They rationed food, they endured the shelling. But as weeks turned into months, supplies dwindled. By the winter of 1941-42, famine gripped the city. Bread rations fell to as little as 125 grams per day, barely enough to survive. Even that bread was mixed with sawdust, cellulose, or other fillers. People boiled wallpaper paste for its starch. Pets vanished. Stories spread of cannibalism. Winter made it worse. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Fuel was gone. Homes and apartments froze. Water pipes burst. Families huddled together in darkness, listening to artillery thunder in the distance. And yet, the city endured. The road of life. The only lifeline for Leningrad was Lake Ladoga, east of the city. When the lake froze in winter, trucks drove across the ice, carrying food in and evacuating civilians. This route became known as the Road of Life. The journey was perilous. German planes and artillery targeted the ice road. Trucks sometimes broke through and vanished beneath the frozen water. Yet, day after day, convoys crossed, keeping the city alive. Children were evacuated this way, bundled in blankets, carried in trucks across the frozen expanse. For many, it was the difference between life and death, culture amid ruin. Even as hunger and death consumed the city, Leningrad's spirit did not break. Artists, musicians, and writers refused to surrender their culture. In August 1942, in the midst of the siege, the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra gathered to perform Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony. Musicians were so weakened by hunger that some fainted during rehearsals, yet the performance went ahead. The sound of music filled the city, broadcast on loudspeakers. German soldiers listening from their positions were astonished. The symphony became a symbol of defiance, proof that even in the face of starvation, humanity could endure. The human toll. The siege was catastrophic. Over the course of nearly 900 days, over 1 million civilians perished, most from starvation, cold, or disease. Entire families vanished. Apartment blocks became silent tombs. And yet, Leningrad did not fall. Its defenders, soldiers and civilians alike, clung to survival. The Red Army launched repeated offensives to break the encirclement. Though many failed, each brought supplies closer. In January 1943, a narrow land corridor was finally opened. A year later, in January 1944, the siege was fully lifted. Hitler's missed opportunity. Historians often debate why Hitler chose to starve Leningrad rather than seize it outright. Some argue that the city's fortifications and size made an assault too costly. Others suggest Hitler wanted to conserve resources for the drive on Moscow. Whatever the reason, the decision prolonged the war. Instead of capturing Leningrad swiftly, Germany became bogged down in a prolonged blockade. The city's survival became a symbol of Soviet resilience, inspiring resistance across the USSR. The Finnish front. To the north, Finland's role was complex. Finnish forces advanced to retake lands lost in the Winter War of 1939–40, but they stopped short of fully joining the assault on Leningrad. Marshal Mannerheim resisted German pressure to storm the city, unwilling to bear responsibility for its destruction. This limited Finland's role, though its armies still contributed to the encirclement. Global perception. News of the siege reached the outside world, stirring horror and sympathy. In Britain and the United States, Leningrad became a symbol of courage. Relief convoys were discussed, though direct aid was nearly impossible. Eventually, through the Lend-Lease program, Allied supplies reached the Soviet Union via the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel. Some of these supplies made their way to Leningrad, easing but never ending the suffering. Endurance and memory. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II, but also one of the most inspiring. The survival of the city against impossible odds became a cornerstone of Soviet identity. After the war, Leningrad was honored as a hero city, its people remembered for their sacrifice and resilience. Today, memorials across St. Petersburg mark the siege. Mass graves, known as the Piskaryovskaya Cemetery, hold the remains of hundreds of thousands of victims. Eternal flames burn in their memory. The story of the siege is not just one of suffering, but of endurance, a reminder of what human beings can withstand when there is no other choice. Army Group North had been tasked with seizing Leningrad, and though it encircled the city, it never captured it. Instead, Hitler's choice to starve the city turned it into a battlefield of endurance, where civilians became warriors of survival. For nearly 900 days, Leningrad endured hunger, cold, and death. Yet it did not surrender. The city's survival was not only a military failure for Germany, but also a moral victory for the Soviet Union. As we leave this chapter, imagine the silent streets of Leningrad in the winter of 1941. Snow falls softly, windows are dark, families huddle together sharing the last crumbs of bread, artillery rumbles in the distance, and still the city endures. This was the siege of Leningrad, a struggle not just for a city, but for the soul of a nation. The beating heart of the plan. From the very beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the central axis of advance was the most important. For Hitler and his generals, the road to Moscow was the road to victory. The Soviet capital was not only the largest city of the USSR with millions of inhabitants, but it was also the seat of Stalin's government, the hub of Soviet communications, and the spiritual center of Soviet power. To capture Moscow, the Germans believed, would be to cut off the head of the Soviet state. They imagined that without its capital, the Soviet Union would collapse like a body drained of life. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three German army groups, was given this task. Its story is one of dazzling victories, grueling battles, fatal delays, and ultimately the first great failure of Hitler's war in the East. Army Group Center, the spear point. Army Group Center was commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. It was the largest and most formidable German force of the invasion. 50 infantry divisions, 9 panzer divisions, 6 motorized divisions, supported by the 2nd Luftwaffe Air Fleet. Within this army group were 2 elite panzer groups. Panzer Group 2, commanded by Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of blitzkrieg tactics. Panzer Group 3, commanded by Hermann Hoth, another master of mobile warfare. Together they formed the armored spearhead that would drive deep into the Soviet Union, encircling and destroying Red Army formations, then turning toward Moscow. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk. The first great clash came within days of the invasion. In late June 1941, German panzer divisions swept around the flanks of Soviet armies in Belarus, near the cities of Bialystok and Minsk. The Red Army, caught by surprise, fought desperately but was overwhelmed. Encirclements known as Kesselschlachten or cauldron battles trapped entire Soviet armies. By early July, the Germans had captured over 300,000 prisoners, destroyed thousands of tanks and guns, and opened the road eastward. For the Wehrmacht, it was a triumph. Officers wrote home boasting of the scale of the victory. Propaganda trumpeted the destruction of Stalin's forces. Many believed the war was already won. But the Soviets did not collapse. New armies formed in the interior. Reinforcements poured toward the front. The Red Army was wounded, but still alive. Smolensk, the next cauldron. The next major target was the city of Smolensk, 400 kilometers west of Moscow. In July 1941, German panzer groups raced eastward, encircling Soviet forces once again. The Battle of Smolensk lasted from July 10th to September 10th. It was brutal. Soviet armies fought stubbornly, counterattacking again and again, trying to break out of encirclement. In the end, the Germans claimed victory, capturing another 300,000 prisoners. But unlike Minsk, Smolensk showed a new pattern. The Soviets resisted longer, fought harder, and launched coordinated counteroffensives. German casualties mounted. The road to Moscow, though open, was bloodied. Hitler's fateful diversion. At this point, German generals, especially Halder and Guderian, urged Hitler to strike directly at Moscow. The capital was only 320 kilometers away. The Red Army was reeling. A swift blow, they argued, could end the campaign. But Hitler disagreed. Obsessed with resources, he diverted his armored forces. He ordered Guderian's Panzer Group 2 southward to Ukraine to help encircle Soviet armies near Kiev. Simultaneously, he directed Panzer Group 3 to assist Army Group North toward Leningrad. This decision delayed the advance on Moscow by crucial weeks. Instead of a swift drive to the capital in August, the offensive stalled. German tanks roared away from the center, leaving infantry to hold the line. The diversion achieved a huge tactical success, the encirclement at Kiev, but it cost precious time. When the Germans returned to the Moscow front in late September, summer was gone. The rains of autumn and the snows of winter were approaching. The Kiev encirclement, a Pyrrhic victory. In September 1941, Guderian's tanks linked up with Army Group South near Kiev. Together, they created one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. The scale was immense. German soldiers marveled at endless columns of prisoners stretching beyond the horizon. It was hailed as one of the greatest victories of the Wehrmacht. But this triumph carried a hidden cost. The drive to Moscow was delayed by more than a month. By the time Army Group Center was ready to resume its advance, the weather had turned. The autumn Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had begun. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow. At last, in October 1941, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the final offensive to seize Moscow. Army Group Center, reinforced with fresh divisions, surged forward. Initial successes were spectacular. At Vyazma and Bryansk, massive encirclements trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. Entire Soviet armies were destroyed. German soldiers believed the end was near. Moscow, they thought, would fall within weeks. But the Soviets did not surrender. Stalin remained in Moscow, refusing to evacuate. The city's defenses were strengthened. Fresh troops, some brought from Siberia after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack in the east, arrived to reinforce the capital. The Rasputitsa, mud and misery. Then came the Rasputitsa. Heavy autumn rains turned Russian roads into seas of mud. German trucks bogged down axle deep. Horses collapsed in the muck. Tanks crawled forward at a snail's pace. Supply lines broke down. Soldiers, exhausted and hungry, trudged through endless mud. Weapons jammed, vehicles broke. The once invincible blitzkrieg stalled, trapped by the Russian landscape itself. Meanwhile, the Soviets regrouped. Stalin appointed General Georgy Zhukov to command the defense of Moscow. Zhukov, calm and ruthless, organized fresh lines of defense. Fortifications rose around the city. Civilians dug trenches and built barricades. Moscow braced for the storm. The first snow. By November, the mud froze. The ground hardened. German tanks and trucks could move again. The offensive resumed. By late November, German forces were within sight of Moscow's suburbs. Some units reached Khimki, only 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. Soldiers could see the spires of the city in the distance. It seemed as if victory was at hand. But winter had arrived. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German troops were not prepared. They had no winter clothing, no antifreeze, no insulated boots. Engines froze, weapons jammed. Soldiers shivered in thin uniforms, huddling for warmth. Frostbite spread. Horses died in the snow. The Red Army, better equipped for the cold, fought back with renewed vigor. Siberian divisions trained for winter warfare counterattacked fiercely. Stalin's speech and Soviet resolve. On November 7, 1941, Stalin staged a massive military parade in Red Square, marking the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. As German armies closed in, Soviet troops marched across the square and directly to the front. Stalin addressed the nation, declaring that Moscow would not fall. His defiance inspired millions. For Soviet soldiers and civilians alike, the defense of Moscow became a matter of survival, of pride, of destiny. The Soviet counteroffensive. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Reinforced by fresh divisions from Siberia, Soviet forces struck along the entire front. The Germans, exhausted, frozen, and overstretched, reeled backward. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht suffered a major defeat. German units were pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The myth of invincibility was broken. Hitler, enraged, forbade retreat, insisting his soldiers hold every inch. The winter of 1941-42 became a nightmare of suffering. The turning point that never came. Though Moscow did not fall, the battle was not the end of the war. The Soviets had saved their capital, but at immense cost. German forces still occupied vast territories. Millions were dead. The Eastern Front remained the largest and bloodiest battlefield of the war. Yet the failure to take Moscow marked a turning point. Hitler's dream of a quick, decisive campaign was shattered. The war would drag on for years, consuming Germany's strength. Human stories. Along the road to Moscow. Behind the statistics lay countless human stories. German soldiers, once confident, now wrote letters filled with despair, describing frozen nights and endless resistance. Soviet civilians, forced to evacuate or fight, endured unimaginable hardship. Families were torn apart, cities burned, villages vanished. And still, life persisted. In Moscow, schools reopened even as bombs fell. Children learned by candlelight in underground shelters. Workers continued to build tanks and guns. Amid hunger and cold, a nation refused to yield. The central drive toward Moscow was the beating heart of Operation Barbarossa. It began with triumphs at Minsk and Smolensk, rose to dazzling success at Vyazma and Bryansk, and came within sight of the Kremlin itself. Yet it ended in failure, halted by mud, snow, and the resilience of the Soviet people. For the Germans, the failure to seize Moscow was the first great crack in the dream of conquest. For the Soviets, it was proof that they could resist, that Hitler was not invincible, that survival was possible. As this chapter closes, imagine the winter of 1941. Snow falling softly on the fields outside Moscow, the sound of gunfire echoing through frozen forests, German soldiers huddling in thin coats, Soviet troops advancing with bayonets fixed. The road to Moscow had become the road to stalemate, and the war was far from over. To the south of the vast eastern front stretched the broad plains of Ukraine. Known for centuries as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine's fertile soil produced grain, sugar, and livestock in abundance. Its black earth, called Chernozem, was so rich that a single handful could sustain crops for years. To Adolf Hitler, Ukraine was more than land. It was the key to his vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. Whoever controlled Ukraine, he believed, controlled the food supply of Europe. But Ukraine was also home to great cities. Kiev, the ancient capital, a city of golden domes and deep history, Kharkov, an industrial center, Odessa, the proud Black Sea port. To take Ukraine would be to take not only resources, but also pride. And so, when Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, Army Group South was assigned this enormous task to sweep across Ukraine, capture its cities, seize its fields, and destroy the Red Army defending it. What unfolded was one of the most brutal campaigns of the war, a story of triumph and tragedy, encirclements and starvation, courage and cruelty. Army Group South, the Southern Spear. Army Group South was commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced generals. His forces were vast, but stretched across a broad front. 4 panzer divisions, fewer than in the north and center. Dozens of infantry divisions, strong support from Romanian and Hungarian armies allied to Germany, Luftwaffe units to dominate the skies. Facing them was the Soviet Southwestern Front under General Mikhail Kirponos. Unlike in Belarus, where the Red Army had collapsed quickly, Soviet resistance in Ukraine was stronger, more coordinated, and determined to defend the fertile lands and the capital of Kiev. The first battles, Lvov and Galicia. In late June 1941, German forces struck through Galicia, the western region of Ukraine. Their target was Lvov, modern-day Lviv. Soviet troops resisted fiercely. The battles around Lvov and Brody turned into one of the largest tank clashes of the early war, with thousands of Soviet and German tanks locked in combat. Although the Soviets lost heavily, they slowed the German advance. The terrain of western Ukraine, forests, marshes, rivers, favored defenders. Unlike the swift collapse in Belarus, here the Wehrmacht faced tougher going. Still, by early July, Lvov had fallen, and the road to central Ukraine lay open. The struggle for Kiev. The jewel of Ukraine was Kiev, the city on the Dnieper River. With its monasteries, ancient cathedrals, and broad avenues, Kiev was both a cultural treasure and a military stronghold. Stalin ordered it defended at all costs. Throughout July and August, Soviet armies dug in around Kiev. Trenches and fortifications lined the approaches. Bridges across the Dnieper were mined. Civilians joined the effort, digging and preparing defenses. The Germans advanced steadily, but resistance was fierce. The Red Army fought stubbornly, launching counterattacks that slowed Rundstedt's progress. By August, the front had stabilized. Kiev remained in Soviet hands, a thorn in the side of the German advance. Hitler's decision. The Great Encirclement. At this point, a debate erupted within the German High Command. Some generals, including Halder and Guderian, argued that the main effort should remain directed toward Moscow. Kiev, they believed, could wait. But Hitler thought differently. Obsessed with Ukraine's resources, he ordered a massive encirclement of Soviet forces around Kiev. To accomplish this, he diverted Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2 southward from Army Group Center. Linking with Rundstedt's forces coming from the west, they would trap the Soviet armies defending Kiev in a gigantic pocket. It was a risky maneuver, pulling armored forces away from the central drive, but Hitler believed the prize was worth it. The Battle of Kiev. In September 1941, the trap closed. German panzer divisions swept around Kiev from the north and south, linking near Lochwitza. Entire Soviet armies, 4 in total, were encircled. The scale was unprecedented. The Battle of Kiev became one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. For weeks they fought desperately to break out, but German forces held firm. Ammunition ran out, food dwindled. One by one Soviet units surrendered or were destroyed. General Mikhail Kirponos, the Soviet commander, was killed trying to escape. The Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Prisoners, equipment, entire formations wiped out. Kiev itself fell to the Germans on September 19, 1941. For the Wehrmacht, it was a stunning victory. Hitler exulted, declaring it the greatest triumph of his career. Propaganda trumpeted the capture of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. German soldiers marveled at the endless columns of Soviet captives. But the victory carried a hidden cost: time. The encirclement delayed the drive on Moscow by over a month. When Army Group Center finally resumed its advance, autumn rains had begun, followed by the brutal Russian winter. The triumph at Kiev would prove a Pyrrhic victory. The fate of the prisoners. For the Soviet soldiers captured at Kiev, the ordeal was just beginning. Herded into open fields, camps, and makeshift enclosures, they faced starvation and disease. German planners had no intention of feeding millions of prisoners. By the winter of 1941-42, hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs had died from hunger, exposure, and neglect. In some camps, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The tragedy of Kiev was not only a military defeat, but a humanitarian catastrophe. German occupation of Ukraine. With Kiev and much of Ukraine in German hands, occupation policies took hold. The land was to be exploited for the Reich. Grain, livestock, and industrial goods were seized and shipped westward. The German occupation was brutal. Entire villages were burned in reprisals against partisans. Jews were targeted for extermination. One of the most infamous massacres occurred in Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, where in September 1941, German Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators murdered over 33,000 Jews in just 2 days. Ukraine's people, initially hopeful that German rule might free them from Stalin's oppression, quickly discovered the reality: forced labor, starvation, and mass killings. Resistance grew. Partisan movements spread across forests and swamps, striking at German supply lines and collaborators. The strategic importance of Ukraine. Why was Ukraine so important? Beyond its fertile fields, Ukraine held vast natural resources: coal in the Donbas region, iron and steel in its industrial cities, ports on the Black Sea linking to the Mediterranean. Hitler dreamed of turning Ukraine into a German colony, feeding the Reich and sustaining its war effort. But occupation brought endless resistance, and the dream became a quagmire. The battle for Odessa. Further south on the Black Sea coast, the port city of Odessa became another stronghold. Romanian forces, allied to Germany, laid siege to the city in August 1941. Soviet defenders resisted stubbornly for 2 months, inflicting heavy casualties. Finally, in October, Soviet forces evacuated by sea and Odessa fell. It was a victory for the Axis, but one that drained Romanian strength. The occupation of Odessa was marked by mass executions and brutal reprisals, deepening the suffering of civilians. The wider picture: victory and delay. By the end of 1941, the Germans had conquered most of Ukraine. Kiev, Kharkov, and Odessa were in their hands. Millions of prisoners had been taken, yet the Red Army was not destroyed. New Soviet armies formed east of the Dnieper. Factories relocated to the Urals continued to produce weapons. Most importantly, the Kiev encirclement delayed the attack on Moscow. The time lost in Ukraine gave the Soviets precious weeks to prepare defenses around their capital. When winter came, the Germans were bogged down in snow and ice, far from their goals. Human stories of Ukraine. Behind the battles lay human lives. Families torn apart as fathers were conscripted, sons taken prisoner, mothers left to care for children amid hunger, villages destroyed in fighting, fields left unharvested, refugees streaming eastward hoping to escape occupation. And yet amid the devastation, resilience endured. Partisans carried messages, sabotaged railways, and hid fugitives. In Kiev, underground networks resisted the occupiers. In villages, neighbors shared scraps of bread, determined to survive. The Southern Campaign of 1941 was both a triumph and a tragedy. The Wehrmacht captured Ukraine, destroyed Soviet armies, and seized Kiev in one of history's greatest encirclements. Yet in doing so, it squandered time and resources, setting the stage for failure at Moscow. For Ukraine, the campaign brought unimaginable suffering, famine, occupation, massacres, and destruction. Its fields, once symbols of abundance, became battlefields. Its cities, once thriving, became ruins. Its people, once farmers and workers, became victims of a brutal war they had not chosen. As we leave this chapter, imagine the golden domes of Kiev in autumn sunlight, overshadowed by smoke and ruin. Imagine endless lines of prisoners marching westward. Imagine villages emptied, fields burned, families scattered. This was the Southern Campaign, the conquest of Ukraine, the fall of Kiev, and the high point of Hitler's early victories. But beneath the triumph lay the seeds of future defeat. For the Reich, Kiev was a victory that cost too much. For the Soviets, it was a catastrophe that steeled their will to fight on. A nation on fire. By the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union had suffered staggering losses. Millions of soldiers had been killed or captured. Vast territories, Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, lay under German occupation. Cities burned, villages were emptied, families were scattered. And yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, as German armies pressed deeper into the land, the Soviet people responded with a strategy both ancient and desperate: scorched earth. If the invaders wanted the land, they would find it barren. If they wanted to exploit resources, they would find them destroyed. And if they sought to rule the people, they would meet resistance in the forests, in the fields, in the ruins of cities. This chapter is the story of that resistance. Organized, improvised, and often born of sheer survival. It is the story of factories dismantled and moved east, of partisans striking from the shadows, of civilians choosing to burn their own homes rather than leave them to the enemy. It is the story of a nation on fire and a people who refuse to surrender. The order, not one step back. From the very beginning, Joseph Stalin recognized the need for ruthless determination. In July 1941, as the German advance seemed unstoppable, he issued his famous directive: not one step back. Retreat was to be punished. Soldiers who abandoned their positions faced execution. Commanders who surrendered could expect no mercy from their own government. Fear was used as a weapon, binding soldiers to their posts. This iron discipline was brutal, but it stiffened Soviet resistance. Across the front, Soviet units fought to the last, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and for defenses to be built. The scorched earth strategy. As Soviet armies retreated, they left nothing behind. Villages were burned, bridges blown, crops destroyed. Factories were dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto trains and shipped thousands of kilometers east, beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire industries vanished overnight, leaving behind only ruins for the Germans to capture. This was not new in Russian history. During Napoleon's invasion of 1812, the Russians had used the same strategy. Now, in 1941, it returned on a far larger scale. The scorched earth policy was devastating. Civilians often lost their homes and livelihoods. Families burned their own barns, slaughtered livestock, and fled eastward. But the effect on the Germans was equally devastating. Where they expected to find food and shelter, they found ashes. Where they hoped to seize factories, they found only wreckage. Evacuation of industry. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Soviet scorched earth effort was the evacuation of industry. From June to December 1941, more than 1,500 factories were dismantled and moved eastward to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Machine tools were loaded onto rail cars, sometimes while bombs fell nearby. Workers traveled with their equipment, setting up new plants in distant cities. Entire industrial complexes, including steel mills and tank factories, reappeared hundreds of kilometers away. By 1942, these relocated factories were producing tanks, planes, and guns in staggering numbers. The very weapons that would later crush the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and Kursk were forged in these emergency workshops, born out of scorched earth. Partisan warfare, the invisible front. As German forces occupied vast swaths of Soviet territory, they faced not only the Red Army, but also a growing movement of resistance fighters, the partisans. These groups were often composed of soldiers cut off behind enemy lines, civilians who refused to submit, or NKVD officers trained in sabotage. They operated in forests, swamps, and mountains, striking quickly and vanishing into the wilderness. Partisan tactics included blowing up railways and bridges, attacking German supply convoys, ambushing isolated garrisons, assassinating collaborators. Though small at first, the partisan movement grew steadily. By 1943, tens of thousands of partisans operated across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. For the Germans, supply lines became perilous, and no occupied village was truly secure. German reprisals. The German response to partisan warfare was merciless. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisals. Civilians were executed, sometimes hundreds at a time, as punishment for suspected collaboration with partisans. One chilling example came in the Belarusian village of Katyn, where German troops massacred the entire population and burned the village to the ground. Such atrocities were repeated across the occupied territories. The brutality only fueled resistance. Each massacre drove more people to join the partisans, creating a cycle of violence that the Germans could never fully control. Life under occupation. For civilians trapped in occupied territory, life was harsh. German occupation policies were designed not for governance but for exploitation. Food was requisitioned to feed German soldiers and the Reich. Millions of civilians were forced into labor, some sent to Germany as slave workers. Jews were targeted for extermination, with mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned. And yet, even under occupation, Soviet loyalty persisted. Underground networks smuggled information, civilians hid wounded soldiers, resistance was dangerous, but it became a form of survival. The role of women. Women played a critical role in Soviet resistance. With millions of men at the front, women became fighters, saboteurs, and messengers. They also kept families alive during famine and displacement. Some joined partisan bands carrying rifles into the forests. Others worked in relocated factories producing weapons day and night. Many risked their lives smuggling food, sheltering fugitives, or passing intelligence to the Red Army. The war blurred the lines between soldier and civilian. In the Soviet Union, the entire population became part of the struggle. Stalin's propaganda and morale. To sustain this resistance, propaganda was essential. Stalin framed the war as a great patriotic war, linking it to Russia's long history of defending the motherland from invaders, from the Mongols, from the Poles, from Napoleon. Songs, posters, and speeches filled the airwaves. Writers and poets were mobilized to inspire courage. The message was simple. The enemy was brutal, but Russia would endure. This narrative gave meaning to suffering. It turned the scorched earth and the sacrifices of civilians into acts of national heroism. The harsh winter of 1941-42. As winter fell, German armies froze outside Moscow, and Soviet resistance stiffened. Civilians endured unimaginable hardship, but the failure of the Germans to break through gave hope. Partisans took advantage of the snow and forests, ambushing weakened German units. Evacuated factories in the Urals roared to life, producing T-34 tanks and Yak fighter planes. It was as if the Soviet Union, though bleeding, had survived the worst storm and was beginning to recover. Psychological resistance. Beyond physical battles, there was also the psychological war. To the Germans, the Soviet refusal to surrender seemed irrational. Cities like Moscow and Leningrad should have collapsed under pressure, yet they held on. The scorched earth strategy, though painful, denied the Germans the resources they expected. Instead of finding a docile population and rich farmland, they found destruction and hostility. The Soviet people, though suffering terribly, had chosen to resist not only with weapons, but with will. Global reactions. News of Soviet resistance reached the outside world. In Britain, newspapers marveled at the courage of Moscow's defenders. In the United States, sympathy for the Soviet Union grew, softening the hostility many Americans felt toward communism. Lend-Lease aid expanded, with trucks, planes, and food beginning to arrive in Soviet ports. Though slow at first, this aid would become a lifeline in the years ahead. Legacy of the resistance. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union was battered but unbroken. The scorched earth strategy had bought time. The partisans had tied down German forces. The evacuation of industry ensured that weapons would continue to flow to the front. Most importantly, the Soviet people had shown that they would not collapse. The Germans had underestimated their resilience. Instead of surrender, they found defiance. Instead of submission, they found resistance. The story of Soviet resistance and scorched earth is not one of glorious victories. It is a story of survival, of sacrifice, of destruction chosen over submission. It is the story of farmers burning their fields, workers dismantling factories, partisans hiding in forests, and families enduring hunger and loss. It is also the story of a miscalculation, the German belief that the Soviet Union would crumble in weeks. Instead, the Soviet people turned their land into a weapon, their suffering into strength, and their despair into determination. As we close this chapter, imagine the endless Russian steppe in the autumn of 1941, fields ablaze, smoke rising into the sky, German soldiers marching into ruins, and far to the east, trains carrying factories and workers into the Ural Mountains, where new weapons are already being built. This was the scorched earth. This was resistance, and it was only the beginning. By late November 1941, the German armies stood at the very gates of Moscow, From some forward positions, German soldiers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were less than 30 kilometers from the city center, close enough to feel that victory was at hand. And yet, in those same days, the first snowstorms swept across the Russian plain. The ground froze hard. Temperatures plunged far below zero. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht, clad in thin summer uniforms, shivered in the icy wind. Engines seized, oil congealed, horses dropped in their tracks. The dream of a swift campaign was colliding with the Russian winter, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the will of Joseph Stalin. This chapter tells the story of the Moscow counteroffensive, when the Red Army, battered, bloodied, yet unbroken, launched a strike that pushed the Germans back for the first time. It was not only a turning point of Operation Barbarossa, but also a moment that changed the psychological balance of the war. The situation in late 1941. After 5 months of invasion, the Wehrmacht had achieved staggering successes. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Kharkov had fallen. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. German forces occupied vast swaths of European Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Yet victory remained elusive. The Red Army, though repeatedly crushed, always seemed to rise again with fresh troops. Factories evacuated to the Urals were beginning to produce tanks and planes. Partisans harassed German supply lines. Most critically, the German advance had outrun its logistics. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Ammunition and fuel arrived late, food was scarce, and now winter was tightening its grip. Hitler's orders: no retreat. As the Germans approached Moscow, many generals urged caution. The army was exhausted, casualties were high, winter clothing had not been delivered. Some argued for halting the advance until spring. But Hitler refused. He insisted that Moscow must fall before winter. He believed that capturing the Soviet capital would break Stalin's regime and end the war. Retreat, he declared, was forbidden. Every soldier was to hold his ground, no matter the cost. This order placed enormous strain on the German army. Men dug shallow trenches in frozen earth, trying to shelter from the cold. Vehicles broke down, sometimes abandoned in the snow. Frostbite spread like wildfire, claiming fingers, toes, and lives. Moscow prepares. Inside Moscow, panic had gripped the population in October. Government ministries had evacuated eastward. Rumors spread that the city would be abandoned. Crowds flooded railway stations, desperate to flee. But Stalin remained. On November 7, 1941, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, he staged a massive military parade in Red Square. Tanks and soldiers marched across the cobblestones, past the reviewing stand where Stalin stood. From there, many marched directly to the front lines. In his speech, Stalin invoked Russia's long history of repelling invaders, from the Mongols to Napoleon. His defiance reassured the people. Moscow would not be surrendered. The Siberian reinforcements. A turning point came with the arrival of reinforcements from the east. Soviet intelligence, through the spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941. This freed Stalin to transfer divisions from Siberia to Moscow. These troops were battle-hardened, well-trained in winter warfare and equipped with warm clothing, skis, and the reliable T-34 tanks. Their arrival transformed the balance of power around Moscow. The German stalemate. By late November, German forces were spent. They had reached towns like Khimki, only 30 kilometers from Moscow, but could go no further. The cold froze weapons and stalled vehicles. Soldiers huddled in shallow pits, burning scraps of wood to survive. Rations dwindled. Ammunition ran short. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now struggled. Snowstorms grounded planes. Engines failed to start in the bitter cold. Meanwhile, Soviet industry continued to churn out replacements, filling the skies with new aircraft. For the first time, the German advance halted. The invincible blitzkrieg had reached its limit. December 5th, 1941, the counter-offensive begins. On December 5th, 1941, the Red Army struck. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire across the front. Fresh divisions, including Siberian troops, surged forward through snow and ice. T-34 tanks with wide tracks ideal for winter terrain plowed through German lines. Ski troops glided across fields, striking where least expected. The Germans, exhausted and unprepared, reeled backward. Units that had advanced for months suddenly found themselves in retreat. The scope of the counter-offensive. The Soviet counterattack stretched across a 1,000-kilometer front, from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. Everywhere, German forces were pushed back. Towns and villages captured weeks earlier were retaken. German soldiers, forbidden to retreat by Hitler's orders, often fought to the death. But when collapse came, it was chaotic. Vehicles were abandoned. Soldiers fled through snow. Frostbite claimed thousands. By January 1942, the Germans had been driven back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The capital was safe. The Red Army's resilience. The counteroffensive shocked the world. Only months earlier, the Soviet Union had seemed on the brink of collapse. Now, its armies were advancing. Much of the success lay in the T-34 tank. With sloped armor, powerful guns, and wide tracks, it outperformed many German tanks, especially in winter. Soviet factories relocated east of the Urals produced them in ever-growing numbers. Equally important was morale. Soviet soldiers fought with the knowledge that they were defending their homes, their families, their capital. For many, it was not simply a war, but a fight for survival. German desperation. For the Germans, the retreat from Moscow was a bitter shock. Letters from the front describe soldiers bewildered by the ferocity of the Soviet counterattack. Some feared they would freeze to death before spring. Yet Hitler remained defiant. He raged at his generals, forbidding organized retreats. He demanded that soldiers hold every position, even when untenable. Entire units were sacrificed to delay the Soviet advance. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht had met an enemy it could not defeat quickly. The global impact. News of the Soviet counteroffensive electrified the world. In Britain, Winston Churchill hailed it as proof that Hitler could be beaten. In the United States, which had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Soviet resilience inspired confidence that the Allies could prevail. The war had become truly global, and at its heart, the Soviet Union had shown that it could withstand the might of the Wehrmacht. The human cost. The Battle of Moscow was one of the bloodiest of the war. Estimates vary, but combined casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, exceeded 1 million men on both sides. Civilians suffered terribly. Villages around Moscow were destroyed. Families endured hunger and cold. Yet the city itself survived. Moscow never fell. For the Soviet people, this was a source of immense pride, a symbol that their nation could endure anything. Stalin's prestige. For Stalin, the victory was more than military. It cemented his prestige. Only months earlier, his leadership had been doubted. Now, he stood as the defender of Moscow, the leader who had saved the nation. His grip on power tightened. His image as the man of steel was reinforced. For the Allies, Stalin became a vital partner, a symbol of resilience against fascism. Strategic consequences. The failure to capture Moscow marked the first major strategic defeat of Nazi Germany. Hitler's plan for a quick war in the East was ruined. The conflict would drag on for years, consuming men and resources. For the Soviets, the counteroffensive was not the end of their suffering, but it was a beginning proof that they could fight back, that the Red Army could not only survive, but also advance. The Moscow counteroffensive was more than a battle. It was a turning of the tide, a moment when despair gave way to hope, when retreat gave way to advance. Imagine the scene in December 1941. German soldiers stumbling backward through snow, frostbitten and broken. Soviet troops advancing with bayonets fixed, their breath misting in the icy air. Civilians in Moscow hearing the news that the enemy was retreating, daring to hope for the first time. The invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped. The capital of the Soviet Union had been saved. The war was far from over, but the myth of German inevitability had been shattered. This was the Moscow counteroffensive, the first great Soviet victory of the Great Patriotic War, and the moment when history itself seemed to turn, beyond maps and battles. When we look at the story of Operation Barbarossa, we often see maps covered in arrows, names of cities captured, numbers of divisions destroyed. But behind those lines on maps and statistics of battles lies another story, the story of people. Soldiers in trenches, civilians in villages, prisoners in camps, children caught between retreat and advance. Barbarossa was not just a campaign of military conquest. It was a war of annihilation. From the beginning, it was waged with an intensity and brutality that surpassed the norms of warfare. Millions perished not only from bullets and bombs, but from starvation, disease, cold, and deliberate extermination. This chapter will step away from the battlefield and look instead at the human cost of Barbarossa. The soldiers who fought and died in unimaginable numbers, the civilians who suffered famine and occupation, the victims of mass shootings, and the prisoners of war whose fate was as grim as any in history. The soldiers' sacrifice. By the end of 1941, the German army had suffered over 750,000 casualties on the Eastern Front. Soldiers who had marched across Poland and France with relative ease now faced exhaustion, frostbite, and endless resistance. Letters home tell of hunger, of comrades lost, of disbelief at the vastness of Russia. For the Soviet side, the numbers were staggering. In just the first 6 months, the Red Army lost over 3 million soldiers captured and at least 3 million more killed or wounded. Entire armies ceased to exist. Divisions disappeared in the cauldrons of Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk. Yet the Soviet Union kept fighting. Fresh recruits were mobilized. Sometimes they marched to the front without rifles, told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Losses that would have broken other nations were absorbed at unimaginable human cost. The prisoners of war. No group suffered more than the Soviet prisoners of war. German planning never intended to feed or care for them. The hunger plan, devised by Nazi officials, explicitly called for the starvation of millions of Soviet POWs and civilians so that German soldiers and the Reich could be supplied. By the spring of 1942, over 2 million Soviet POWs had died in German captivity of hunger, exposure, or outright execution. Prisoners were herded into open fields with no shelter. Rations were minimal, sometimes a crust of bread, sometimes nothing at all. Winter claimed thousands each night, bodies frozen in the snow. In some camps, epidemics spread unchecked. These deaths were not accidents of war, they were deliberate. The Nazi leadership saw Soviet prisoners as subhuman, unworthy of survival. Civilians under occupation. As German armies swept across the Soviet Union, tens of millions of civilians came under occupation. Their lives were marked by deprivation, fear, and violence. Food requisitions stripped villages bare. Grain and livestock were seized to feed the Wehrmacht and shipped back to Germany. Entire populations were subjected to forced labor, some deported to Germany as Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers. Resistance, or even suspicion of resistance, brought brutal reprisals. In Belarus and Ukraine, villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned to the ground, civilians were shot in mass executions. The human cost here was not measured only in death, but also in hunger, fear, and the destruction of entire communities. The Holocaust in the East. Barbarossa marked the beginning of the Holocaust in its most expansive and violent form. As German armies advanced, Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed behind. Their task was clear: to eliminate Jews, communists, Roma, and other groups deemed undesirable. In town after town, Jewish populations were rounded up, marched to ravines or fields, and shot. Entire communities were annihilated. One of the most infamous massacres occurred in Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev. On September 29–30, 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. Men, women, children, entire families were executed by machine gun fire. This was only one massacre among hundreds. By the end of 1941, over 1 million Jews had been killed in the territories seized during Barbarossa. Hunger and starvation. The scorched earth strategy, combined with German requisitions, created widespread famine. In occupied cities, bread became scarce. Civilians survived on weeds, bark, and whatever scraps they could find. Nowhere was the suffering greater than in Leningrad, where over 1 million civilians perished during the siege. But even beyond the cities, hunger was everywhere. Villages emptied, children with hollow eyes wandered roads. The hunger plan aimed to redirect food from the Soviet population to the German army and homeland. The suffering was not accidental, it was policy. The winter of 1941–42. As temperatures plunged to -30°C, suffering deepened. German soldiers froze in inadequate clothing, Soviet civilians burned furniture for warmth. For the Red Army, winter was both a curse and a blessing. Many soldiers perished from exposure, but those equipped for the cold turned it into an ally. Siberian divisions trained for snow and ice counterattacked with ferocity. For civilians, there was little escape. Roads were clogged with refugees, many freezing on the journey. Families huddled in ruins, waiting for spring, often in vain. The partisan struggle. Behind German lines, partisans waged a relentless campaign of sabotage, but their war came at a cost. Villages accused of aiding partisans were wiped out. Civilians were executed in reprisals, sometimes by the hundreds. The partisan struggle blurred the line between combatant and civilian. German soldiers often treated entire regions as hostile, unleashing terror indiscriminately. The human cost was borne by ordinary people who found themselves trapped between occupiers and resistors. Displacement and refugees. Millions fled eastward, away from the advancing Germans. Trains crammed with evacuees carried families, workers, and entire factories. Roads filled with carts, livestock, and refugees on foot. The scale of displacement was unprecedented. Cities were emptied. Families were divided, sometimes permanently. For many, the journey was as deadly as occupation. Hunger and exposure claimed countless lives along the way. Psychological toll. The human cost of Barbarossa was not only physical but psychological. Soldiers wrote of exhaustion, of numbness to death. Civilians described the silence of abandoned villages, the terror of occupation, the despair of losing children to hunger or violence. For the Germans, the brutality of the campaign left its mark. Soldiers became desensitized to mass killings. Many participated in atrocities, convinced by propaganda that they were fighting subhumans. Others were horrified but felt powerless to resist. For the Soviets, the trauma of invasion left scars that would last generations. The numbers of death. Historians estimate that between June and December 1941, the Soviet Union lost over 3 million soldiers killed or missing, 3 million captured, most of whom died. Over 7 million civilians killed through executions, starvation, and sieges. In total, the human cost of Barbarossa in 1941 alone exceeded 13 million lives, more than the population of some European countries. These numbers are almost beyond comprehension. Each represents not a statistic, but a person, a soldier, a mother, a child, a family. memory, and meaning. The human cost of Barbarossa shaped the Soviet Union's memory of the war. For decades, the Great Patriotic War was remembered not only as a military struggle, but as a national tragedy, marked by immense sacrifice. Monuments across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus honor the victims. Mass graves remain as silent witnesses. Survivors told their stories of hunger, of courage, of loss. For Germany, Barbarossa became a chapter of shame. The atrocities committed, the millions left to die, were crimes that could never be justified. Operation Barbarossa was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of ideologies, fought not only on battlefields but in the lives of millions of ordinary people. Its human cost was measured in hunger, in cold, in mass graves, in broken families, in silenced towns. Imagine, as this chapter closes, the human faces of Barbarossa, a Soviet soldier gaunt with hunger marching barefoot in the snow as a prisoner, a German infantryman writing a letter home with numb fingers wondering if he will survive the winter, a child in a village clutching a crust of bread watching the world collapse, a mother digging a grave in frozen ground. This was the true cost of Operation Barbarossa. Not arrows on a map, but lives, millions upon millions, consumed by fire, frost, and fury. Looking back at the invasion. When dawn broke on June 22, 1941, no one could truly imagine what the next 4 years would bring. Operation Barbarossa began as the greatest invasion in history, planned with confidence and ambition, launched with millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks, aimed at crushing the Soviet Union in a single lightning strike. By December of that same year, the dream had already faltered. Moscow stood, Leningrad endured, Kiev had fallen, but at a cost that delayed the central drive. Millions were dead, millions displaced, and yet the Soviet Union remained alive. The consequences of that summer and autumn did not end in 1941. They rippled outward, shaping the course of the war, the fate of nations, and the memory of generations. This final chapter will look at the legacy of Barbarossa, its military, political, and human consequences, its place in world history, and what it still means today. A turning point in the war. Barbarossa was meant to be a quick campaign. Hitler believed that in a matter of weeks the Red Army would collapse and the Soviet Union would crumble. Instead, the invasion marked the beginning of a war of attrition that would bleed Germany dry. The failure to take Moscow in 1941 meant that Germany lost its best chance for victory. From that point forward, the Wehrmacht faced not a short campaign, but a grinding, endless struggle against a foe with vast manpower, growing industrial capacity, and the will to endure almost any loss. The Eastern Front became the decisive theater of World War II. More than 80% of German military casualties in the war occurred there. The seeds of Germany's eventual defeat were sown in the fields, forests, and cities of Barbarossa. The human legacy. The human cost of Barbarossa was almost beyond comprehension. In just the first 6 months, more than 13 million people, soldiers, and civilians had died. That number would multiply many times over by the end of the war. For the Soviet Union, the war became the defining trauma of the 20th century. Entire generations were marked by loss. Villages were erased, families were shattered, yet the endurance of the people became a source of pride, remembered in the Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War. For Germany, the legacy was darker. Barbarossa was not only a military campaign, but also a crime of unprecedented scale. The deliberate starvation of civilians, the execution of prisoners, and the mass killings of Jews and other minorities revealed the true nature of Nazi ideology. After the war, these crimes stood at the center of the Nuremberg trials and became enduring symbols of the horrors of fascism. The Holocaust and the East. Barbarossa accelerated the Holocaust. While persecution of Jews had begun earlier, the invasion of the Soviet Union opened vast new territories to Nazi violence. Einsatzgruppen followed behind the front lines, carrying out mass shootings that killed more than 1 million people in 1941 alone. The ghettos of Poland expanded eastward. Entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were destroyed. Massacres such as Babi Yar, where tens of thousands were murdered in 2 days, revealed the industrial scale of killing that would culminate in Auschwitz and other death camps. The Holocaust cannot be separated from Barbarossa. The invasion was not only about territory but also about ideology, about reshaping Eastern Europe into a racial empire, with Jews, Slavs, and others eliminated or enslaved. The Soviet Union's survival. The greatest legacy of Barbarossa was perhaps this: the Soviet Union survived. Against all odds, despite staggering losses, despite cities encircled, despite millions of soldiers captured, the Soviet state did not collapse. Why? Depth of territory. The vast geography of Russia meant that even as Germans advanced, the Soviet Union could retreat eastward, relocating industries beyond the Urals. Industrial relocation. Thousands of factories dismantled and moved produced tanks, planes, and weapons in massive numbers. By 1942, Soviet production outpaced Germany's. People's endurance. Civilians endured hunger, cold, and occupation, yet continued to support the war effort. Women entered factories, children dug trenches, families sacrificed everything. Leadership and morale. Stalin's brutal but unyielding leadership, combined with propaganda that framed the war as a patriotic struggle, gave meaning to suffering and inspired resistance. The survival of the Soviet Union in 1941 was one of the pivotal events of the 20th century. Without it, the course of the entire world might have been different. Germany's fatal mistake. For Germany, Barbarossa was the fatal mistake. By opening the Eastern Front, Hitler condemned the Reich to fight a two-front war, the very situation he had always sought to avoid. The diversion to Kiev, the failure to capture Moscow, the underestimation of Soviet strength, the lack of preparation for winter, all revealed flaws in German planning. But the deepest flaw was ideological. The belief that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with a single blow blinded Hitler and his generals to the true challenge they faced. From 1941 onward, Germany was trapped in a war of attrition it could not win. Impact on the wider world. The legacy of Barbarossa extended far beyond the Eastern Front. Britain. The invasion brought relief to Britain, which had stood alone against Hitler. Churchill welcomed the Soviet Union as an ally, declaring that any foe of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain. United States. Barbarossa shifted American perceptions. Though still officially neutral in June 1941, the U.S. began to extend Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. After Pearl Harbor in December, the USSR became a full partner in the Allied coalition. Global war. With the Soviet Union in the fight, World War II became truly global. The Eastern Front tied down the majority of German forces, allowing Britain and later the United States to build strength in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually Western Europe. The Eastern Front as the crucible. Barbarossa created a front that would become the crucible of World War II. From 1941 to 1945, the battles of the Eastern Front dwarfed those in the West in scale and intensity. Stalingrad, 1942-43, would mark the turning point, where Germany's Sixth Army was destroyed. Kursk, 1943, would be the largest tank battle in history. The Red Army's relentless advance from 1943 to 1945 would push the Wehrmacht all the way back to Berlin. None of this would have been possible without the survival of Moscow in 1941, and that survival was made necessary by Barbarossa's failure. Lessons of Barbarossa. Historians continue to draw lessons from Barbarossa. Never underestimate an opponent's resilience. Germany assumed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. Instead, it endured. Logistics matter. Blitzkrieg relied on short campaigns. The distances of Russia turned it into a war of supply lines, which Germany could not sustain. Ideology can distort strategy. Hitler's racial and political obsessions led to decisions that undermined Germany's own military success. Civilians are central. The war was not fought only by armies, but by entire populations, workers, farmers, partisans, families who bore the brunt of occupation and resistance. Memory and commemoration. In the former Soviet Union, Barbarossa and the Great Patriotic War remain deeply remembered. Monuments rise in every city. Eternal flames burn in memory of the fallen. The siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Moscow, the suffering of civilians, these are sacred chapters in national memory. In Germany, Barbarossa is remembered as both a military disaster and a moral catastrophe. The crimes committed in the East against prisoners, civilians, and Jews became central to post-war reckoning with the Nazi past. Internationally, Barbarossa stands as one of history's most destructive campaigns, a reminder of the dangers of hubris, hatred, and unchecked ambition. A world transformed. As we conclude this journey through the history of Operation Barbarossa, let us pause to reflect. In June 1941, the world saw the greatest invasion in history. By December, that invasion had faltered, leaving behind devastation on a scale almost beyond imagination. Millions were dead, cities burned, families were scattered, and yet the Soviet Union endured. The legacy of Barbarossa is written not only in history books but in the lives of those who lived through it. Soldiers who marched into battle and never returned, civilians who endured hunger and occupation, children who grew up amid ruins. It is also written in the course of the war itself. From the failure of Barbarossa came the long struggle of the Eastern Front, the eventual Soviet advance, and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. Barbarossa reminds us of the power of resilience, the cost of arrogance, and the human capacity to endure suffering beyond measure. It also stands as a warning of what happens when ideology turns war into extermination, when conquest becomes cruelty, when leaders gamble with millions of lives. As this final chapter closes, imagine the silence that followed the storm. Snow falling gently on empty battlefields, fields lying in ruin waiting for spring, villages reduced to ashes, and beyond it all the survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, carrying memories too heavy to ever fully speak. Operation Barbarossa began with thunder and fire, but its legacy is silence, memory, and lessons for generations. And now, as you drift to sleep, let the story rest in your mind. The greatest invasion in history, its failures, its costs, and its enduring lessons. This was Operation Barbarossa.